So we had three conversation points in the breakout rooms. What's up with the song and that's playing in Jesse's head? What's Baldwin doing with that? What's the significance of Jesse's childhood homeboy Otis? And what stood out to you most about Baldwin's writing style? So who wants to share what was discussed in their group? It's not everybody chiming at once, huh? So who discussed the song in their breakout rooms? And if so, what did you talk about? Eric, what was discussed in your guys' breakout rooms?
Did you say Paris or Eric?
I said Eric, but you could share two Paris, either one. But I did ask for Eric. So Paris, you and Eric were in the same group, correct?
Yes.
So what did you guys talk about?
Um, we didn't really talk about anything. I don't think we prepared.
So the group didn't talk about anything, or just Eric didn't talk about nothing. So anyone, what was discussed in your breakout rooms? You had 10 minutes. You were in a breakout room. You should have been talking in the breakout room. What were you talking about? Monica, what was discussed in your breakout room?
We talked about how like Otis kind of it was just like when he was well um Otis kind of represented back when like the father he like excuse me, when he got along with African Americans because he was like because they were friends back then,
Mhm.
but like over time I think he started to hate him, so that's what I got from that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that's a pretty fair assessment, right? Thank you, Monica. Who discussed Baldwin's writing style in their breakout room? Who wants to share that? What stood out most to you about the way James Baldwin writes?
I was gonna say that for the writing style, um, that it makes you feel like you're kind of there, like in the first person, because I feel like most nowadays, like the professional standard is like third person point of view, but for that one, I kind of feel like he's telling the story with us, and it's making you feel like you're like really there, I guess.
Yeah, Jesse, I think that's a spot on depiction of what Baldwin does. What I call it is like he displaces you from wherever you're at and he places you where he wants you to be. And I think a lot of that has to do with the descriptiveness in Baldwin's writing. So when he writes, he talks about sensories, right? He talks about how things look, how things smell, how things sound, how things taste. He goes into great detail with the sensory awareness. Uh, yeah, Jaden, can you say that out loud for me, please? Because you're absolutely right.
Yeah, like descriptive imagery. Like I think that's one of the things that I just picked up on. He goes really into depth with a lot of his work, and like looking at this too, like it was one of those things where it's like I don't know, like I think the best way to describe it is kind of like if you're like at like a movie theater, how they kind of have like that 3D type thing, or like IMAX. Like I feel like that's what that kind of was in writing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to depict it. It's like that IMAX picture clear, picture pure picture 3D submersive experience. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. I do ask that you guys get a pencil and a paper. I'm going to provide you with your third and final theoretical framework for the semester. You will need these for your midterm, which will be in about 2 weeks. Okay, so I want you guys to take this down You can start familiarizing yourself with this concept. So we know we had two theoretical frameworks already. The first one being African American male theory, which states that African people are resistant and resilient with innate capacity for brilliance. So that's the first theoretical framework. The second theoretical framework is funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge speaks to knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation that often goes unrecognized, but it allows cultures to understand their uniqueness and allows cultures to understand their place in the world. So that's funds of knowledge. The last and final theoretical framework comes from the theory, critical race theory. The framework is counter storytelling. So again, it comes from critical race theory. That's the theory. The framework or the tenet is counter storytelling. Counter storytelling is telling stories from the perspective of the marginalized, of the oppressed, of the dominated group, not the dominant group. So, for example, if we are to use the story of American discovery, we're not going to tell that story from the vantage point of Columbus. We're going to tell that story from the vantage points of the indigenous people who were here on this land prior to Columbus arriving, or we'll tell this story from the Africans who were telling Columbus how to get to where he was trying to go, right? So we're not going to tell it again from Columbus's standpoint because he's the dominant. We're going to turn it from the standpoint of those who are marginalized or oppressed. If we're going to tell, if we're going to use the example of the protests from 2 summers ago surrounding George Floyd, we're not going to tell that story from the vantage points of the business owners, of the mayors of the city, of the police, right? We're going to tell that story from the vantage points of the protesters, from the vantage points of George Floyd himself or his family, right? Because that's the marginalized group within this story. Does that make sense to you? Does anybody need me to re-articulate or restate what counter storytelling is? Okay.
If I got it, it's basically just telling the story from the marginalized group, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. So we got that. So when we're jumping into James Baldwin, because again, we're going to spend 2 weeks with Baldwin, I think it's important to understand what I call the Baldwinian pillars of white inferiority. And you know that I use this term white inferiority in place of what normal people call white supremacy. So we have the Baldwinian pillars of white inferiority. So I'll ask you guys, or ask you all, what does a pillar do? What work does a pillar do?
It holds and supports.
Thank you, Jaden. So if you're thinking about what I'm telling you or what I'm going to articulate to you, there's 2 things that hold up this system of white inferiority according to James Baldwin. Those 2 things are the white imagination and the maintenance of white innocence. So what comes off in the white imagination, and then this desire to make sure that whiteness and white people remain innocent no matter what they do. Okay, these are the 2 pillars that maintain, support, and hold up this system of white power. Okay, the white imagination. In my understanding, I think nothing is more quintessential of the white imagination than Hollywood. Because if you think about what Hollywood is, it's because typically, right, who are the producers of these movies? White men, right? They're able to exercise their desires, their fantasies, their fears, and put them on film for the world to see, for the world to digest, right? Has anybody heard of the film Birth of a Nation? Okay. So for those who are like gonna go and take like a film class, this will probably be the first film that you'll watch. Reason being, so they say, it's the way that this is shot, the camera lens that is used. It was ahead of its time, right? The author is, sorry, not the author. The producer of the movie is D.W. Griffith. Now, this film went on tour all across the United States. This film ran in the White House for several months, right? And the subject matter of the film is post-Reconstruction South. So it's after the Civil War. It's the Reconstruction era. And due to this fact, Black people are occupying political office. because black people are now allowed to vote, right? So because black folks are voting, they're putting people in political office. And how these black folks in political office are depicted: feet up on the desk of the Senate, they're eating fried chicken, they're eating watermelon, this very shiftless, lazy, stereotypical depiction of black folks in power, right? While this is going on inside of the political offices, outside in the town itself, black men are running rampant, raping white women or trying to rape white women, right? So much so that in the event of a white woman trying to escape the rape of a black man, she throws herself off the cliff. Interesting tidbit of information: in the movie, there are no black characters. Everyone who is depicted as black is played by a white person with black makeup on or in blackface, okay? So because of the political circumstances, because of the rampant rape of white women, the Ku Klux Klan rise on the scene to be the heroes. They get rid of all the black folks. They restore the power dynamics in the city, and the birth of the nation is birthed through the heroic efforts of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, remember what I said, right? Widely recognized as classic American cinema. If you're going to watch a film class, if you're going to have a film class, it'll be the first film that you'll watch. This film went on tour throughout the entire United States and played in the White House for several months. Okay? Again, the white imagination. His ability to play out his fears, i.e., black folks in office, black men raping white women, right? His fantasies and his desires, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan to place things back in order, right? Another tidbit of information for all you Star Wars fans. I don't know personally, don't know Star Wars, but there's a song in Star Wars that plays when the good guys are winning. And I don't know whatever they call the good guys. If you know Star Wars, you know what the fuck I'm talking about. But that same song that's played in Star Wars, yes, okay, the Jedi, thank you, Jaden. So when they're doing what they do and they're winning and they're beating the bad guys in Star Wars, right, there's a song that plays. That same song is a song that plays when the Ku Klux Klan rode through the town to set order and kill all the black folks. And I think the Jedi are like these white characters, right, with the helmets, right? Correct me if I'm wrong with Star Wars.
No, so the white like dressed characters, like the one in armor, is that the one that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about.
Oh, okay. Those are the stormtroopers. Those are actually the bad guys.
Okay.
So yeah, are you talking about Imperial March?
I think so. I think that's like dun 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 dun, right? Like something like that.
Yeah.
Same song. So now keep in mind the time, right? Birth of the Nation comes out in the early 1900s. Star Wars is what, the 60s at earliest, maybe the 70s? It's not a coincidence. Anyway, so this white imagination at play, okay? Now let's move to the maintenance of white innocence. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Ezekiel Ford, Sandra Bland, etc., 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 right? These are all names of people who become hashtags due to the death at the hands of the white power structure, right? What happens is these perpetrators kill someone. They go before a trial of their peers, and that's very important because it's going to their peers. It's not like our situation for black folks where you're in trial in front of a whole bunch of white folks, right? And by and large, the jury votes that this killing was a justifiable homicide. But in all those circumstances, there's one key factor that allows this homicide to be justifiable. What is that key factor? They all use it. Anybody know? Why is a killing justified? Each one of them feared for their life, right? George Zimmerman could use stand your ground because Trayvon Martin posed as a threat, right? They could kill George Floyd because of the size and the stature of who he was, posed as a threat to the officer, Darren Chauvin, who choked him, right? And I could go on and on and on and on. Justifiable homicide. So let me ask y'all, for those who work, before you filled out that application, or while you're filling out that application, did you have a job description? Was there something that you read that let you know what your responsibility of the job was? Yes or no?
No.
No? So you worked somewhere, Jacob, and you didn't know what you were going to do or be asked to do?
No, I didn't.
Okay. I think you would be rare because for the most part, I know for all the jobs that I applied to, there's a job description, there's your requirements to get the job, there's your responsibilities to perform the job correctly. For all the jobs that I've had, right? I would assume the same would be true for the police department, right? I'm sure they have a job description. I'm sure if we go to LAPD right now, there'll be a job description. There'll be responsibilities, right? And then so when you get hired on this job, before they actually have you perform the job, you go through training, right? Same is true for the police. And what happens is for police, right, they have tactical training on how to engage people when you're in physical combat, and they have arms training, how to clean the weapon, how to shoot the weapon, etc., right? But we have justifiable homicide. So help this make sense for me. You have a job that you signed up to do voluntarily, right? You're trained to do the job, right? You're provided with armor and ammunition to do the job, right? Bulletproof vest, handcuffs, pepper spray, taser, baton, firearm, right? Sometimes a canine, right? But you're afraid of unarmed black men, women, and children. How does that make sense? How is it possible that the whole world doesn't recognize that, one, they signed up to do this job, two, this is part of their job requirement, and three, how we are understand their job is to de-escalate situations and not escalate them, right? But every time that we get into a situation, they're continuously escalating the situation, right? But when they go to trial, everyone in the jury understands that they were in fear of their life. Why is that? The white imagination. All those people in that jury of their peers, they watch movies, they listen to the news. They are under the belief of the white imagination that the black body poses as a threat no matter what weapon that they're carrying. Most of the time, not even having a weapon, their blackness is weapon enough, right? So this is how the white imagination and the maintenance of white innocence work hand in hand to uphold this system we call white inferiority. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I mean when I say these pillars that hold up white inferiority being the maintenance of white innocence and the white imagination? Does anybody need me to re-articulate or restate that? It's very important. Okay. So let's see how these pillars play out in the story of Going to Meet the Man. So this story that you read is from a collection of short stories entitled Going to Meet the Man. It's published by James Baldwin in 1965, okay? And I believe it was Jaden who was saying, no, actually it was Jesse who was saying he kind of places you where he wants you to be in the descriptive nature of his writing, right? So with that being said, we're placed in Jesse's bedroom. Jesse's restless, he can't sleep. His wife is laying next to him. So naturally, he's trying to get it cracking, right? It's a way to get yourself to sleep, kill some time, right? But he can't do that. His mind won't allow him to get into a state to allow his body to get it cracking, if you get my drift, right? He's thinking about the happenings of his day. He's thinking about the work that he has to do to squash the uprising that's taking place in his city. The blacks in his town are protesting and rallying so they can vote. And it's keeping him restless, right? He's thinking about the incident he had in the jail cell where he had to cattle prod the genitals of the leader of the uprising. And all these things are keeping him up. All these things are enabling him to perform his duties as a husband, right? And I think Baldwin does an interesting job of writing this exchange between Jesse and the young brother in the jail cell. Instead of just saying he kicked the boy in the face, this is how Baldwin writes this. His foot leapt out. He had not known it was going to do. He had not known it was going to. And it caught the boy flesh on the jaw. Again, his foot leapt out. He had not known it was going to, and caught the boy flesh on the jaw, right? So he kicked the kid in the face, but he didn't know his foot was going to do that, right? It just kind of happened, okay? So I'm thinking about that. And for me, when I read that, maintenance of white innocence, right? Because he didn't do it intentionally, just kind of knee-jerk reaction. It kind of happened, right? So as he kind of goes through this more, right, he thinks about this singing that takes place. And he says, they were singing to God. They were singing for mercy, and they hope to go to heaven, right? Because they're sinners, so they're hoping to go to heaven, right? And they had even sometimes, and he, Jesse, had even sometimes felt when looking into the eyes of the old woman and a few of the very old men that they were singing for the mercy of his soul too, okay? But then, as the story evolves, he realizes the song is up to something a lot more sinister, right? But he's thinking about himself. He's doing some self-reflection. He says, and Baldwin says he, Jesse, had never thought much about what it meant to be a good person. He tried to be a good person and treat everybody right. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't his fault if the niggers had taken it into their own heads to fight against God and go against the rules laid down in the Bible for everyone to read. Again, the maintenance of white innocence, right? It's not his fault that they're performing this way, which is making him to act brutally towards them, right? So he's innocent. He's just doing his job as the sheriff. Furthermore, he's doing the work of God. So there's no fault to be placed on Jesse, right? He's just doing his duty. And then, so Otis, Jesse's black friend as a child. There's a passage on 243 that I found interesting. He says, Baldwin writes, he, being Jesse, had grown accustomed for the solution of such mysteries to go to Otis. He felt that Otis knew everything, but he could not ask Otis about this. Anyway, he had not seen Otis for 2 days. He had not seen a black face anywhere for more than 2 days. And he now realized, he hadn't seen a black face anywhere, right? So if Jesse goes to Otis to understand racial dynamics, what does that say about the households of Jesse's and the households of Otis as it pertains to conversations around race? What do you guys think? What do you all think? If Jesse goes to Otis to ask if Jesse goes to Otis to ask Otis questions about race dynamics, what does it say about the conversations in the households of Jesse and Otis as it pertains to race? What do you think? Why would you ask somebody a question?
Household is like, he's brought up to be racist, basically, right?
Who's brought up to be racist? Who?
Jesse's household.
Okay. So what does that mean for Otis's household?
Otis's household is shown that any race, black and white or whatever, they should be treated as equals.
Okay, I think let me see how to rephrase this. Let's use this class for example, right? If you guys are asking me questions as your professor, what does that mean? Why would you ask me questions as your professor? What is that?
Because we want to learn.
You want to learn something, right? So, which means by default, I know more about that subject than you would because you're asking me, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So, if Jesse is asking Otis questions about race, what does that mean? Who knows more about race?
Otis.
Otis. Absolutely. So, let me ask you this now. Why does Otis know more about race than Jesse? Why do you think Otis, a black boy, knows more about racism than Jesse, a white boy? Why?
Because he has to experience that, like the consequences of that more.
Absolutely. That's it right there. The consequences for Otis around race are a lot larger than what they are for Jesse. So there's this thing in Western society, in American society, called the talk, right? And each family has the talk when their child gets of a certain age. White households have the talk, black households have the talk. When white households have the talk is about the birds and the bees, right? When black households have the talk, it's about how to engage the police when you're forced to engage the police, how to deal with systems of racism. Black folks are having this talk because it's dependent on their survival. I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. When they get in a certain age, we're going to have that talk, right? And I'm going to have this talk with them. So in the hopes that when they leave my household, they'll make it back home in one piece, right? This is going on with Otis too, right? This is why Jesse hasn't seen a black face for 2 weeks, because the black community knows exactly what's going to happen on top of that hill. And they don't want to be an unintended consequence, right? So their whole side of town went ghost. Is anybody here unfamiliar with the story of Emmett Till? Has anybody not heard of Emmett Till? So you're all aware of Emmett Till? Yes, no, kinda?
Yes.
Okay. Emmett Till is one of those circumstances to where having to know about your surroundings and not doing so will get you caught up, okay? That's why these conversations become important. But while Otis is learning and being taught about race for his survival, Jesse's being socialized into understanding race also, right? Ask you a question. What is the etymology of the term picnic? Etymology just means the origins. What is the etymology? What is the beginning? What is the meaning, the original meaning for the term picnic? No one knows? Let me ask you this then. What is Baldwin describing in this story? Where is Jesse and his family going to? That's revealed at the end of the story. What is this happening? What is Baldwin describing at the end of the story? Jaden, go ahead. You can say that out loud, bro. Exactly. Thank you. You're right.
Yeah. The pick a. Yeah.
To pick a nigga and hang him.
Yeah.
That's what a picnic is to pick a nigga and hang him.
Yeah.
Right? So think about how Baldwin writes this from Jesse's perspective. Page 241. Is that where they got him now? Asked Jesse's father. By this time, there were 3 cars piled behind the first one, with everyone looking excited and shining. And Jesse noticed that they were carrying food. It was like a 4th of July picnic, right? So this is part of culture. It's part of tradition, right? The whole town is going out to observe this social event, right? Another part of the story, he says he looks out over the field and sees what looks like millions of people, at least hundreds, right? So the whole town goes out to observe this happening. But Jesse, as he's observing this, there's a question that continuously plays out in his head. And he asks this question, not out loud, but in his mind at least 3 times. What did he do? What did he do? What did he do? In other words, this man who is being hung, who's being burned, who's being castrated, who's being disembodied, he had to do something to deserve all this, right? It's inconceivable that my mother, my father, their friends, my community is so heartless, so inhumane, so beastly that they would do this to somebody for no reason, right? So again, maintaining this notion of innocence for whiteness in their behavior, right? What did he do? But if you read closely in the story, we know that what he did was knock over an old white lady. So you tell me if knocking over an old white lady is justifies being hung, being burned, being castrated, being disembodied, right? Furthermore, chances are, being in the South in the time setting that this story was written, whoever knocked her over didn't do that shit on purpose, right? That was probably an accident. But that just speaks to the nature of rampant whiteness, right? And don't get too caught up on the fact that this has happened, prior to the 1960s, because the most recent lynchings on record are in 2020. Just a thought. Again, speaking to this viciousness, to this inhumanity, he says, whatever the fire had left undone, so whatever was left after the fire is done burning, right? The hands and the knives and the stones of the people had accomplished. The head was carved in, one eye was torn out, one ear was hanging, but one had to look carefully to realize this, for it was now merely a black charred object on the black charred ground. So what he's talking about is a historical specificity, right? When they would have these lynchings, when they would have these picnics, these social gatherings, right? Those in attendance would walk home with souvenirs. So when the fire gets done burning, they would go up with their knives, take a finger, take it home with them. Take a foot, take it home with them. Somebody would get the genitals, take that home with them, right? They would take pictures, and those would become postcards, and they would mail them out to their families and friends to show how they spent their weekend, right? There's been reports about when homes would be sold in the Deep South, and they would go through the attic and get rid of the old stuff. They would find these body parts. They would find these postcards, right? But we as an American society wants to maintain the innocence of the people who engage in these type of practices. His father, well, I told you, his father said, you wasn't never going to forget this picnic. His father's face was full of sweat. His eyes were very peaceful. At that moment, Jesse loved his father more than he had ever loved him. He felt that his father had carried him through a mighty test, had revealed to him a great secret, which would be the key to his life forever. One more time. He felt that his father had carried him through a mighty test, had revealed to him a great secret, which would be the key to his life forever. Okay? So while Otis' family is being taught to deal with racism, Jesse is also learning how to deal with racism. But what happens in the story, right? So we know that we go through this scene of Jesse replaying this back in his mind. And for me, this is where the song becomes important, right? He's laying in bed, can't get it up, so he's thinking. Song is playing in his head. I went to the river at Jordan. The water came to my knees. Why do I know that shit? Where did I hear this song from? I went to the river at Jordan. the water came to my waist. Now I know these black folks are singing this song, but the lyrics to the song is different from the way that I remember the song. But why do I remember the song? I went to the river at Jordan. The water came over my head. That's why I heard that song. The first lynching I experienced, right? Then he plays this all back in his mind, right? But remember why he can't get it up in the first place. He's restless because of the power dynamics within his town is eroding, is slipping away, right? But the song allows him to remember this key to his life forever, this lynching, right? It makes him remember a time when the power dynamics within his town was done in a way that he felt comfortable. And then that feeling starts to kind of pick up in his stomach and go down to his genitals. And he's able to get it up and perform his manly duty. So what Baldwin is doing with this is he's pointing us to be attentive to the fact of how sexual desire and power work hand in hand. He says there's a relationship between the two. This is why when Jesse felt powerless, he couldn't get it up. He had to remember a time when himself and his people felt empowered, and that allowed him to get it up, right? So there's a connection here between the sexual desire and power. We'll end my portion there. Let's jump into our fishbowl with the time that we have left. You should have 2 for the semester to get your full participation points. You could talk about the journal. You could talk about your breakout rooms. You could talk about my notes. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer? All right, so I'll call that random. Eric, are you prepared to fishbowl? Eric, are you prepared to fishbowl? All right, so we're going to use that as your pass, Eric. I'm going to go back and see if you passed already. If so, you've lost your participation point for the semester. Okay, so next up, Maribel, are you prepared to fishbowl?
I've done
2?
both.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maribel. Paris, are you prepared to fishbowl?
No, can I use my skip?
Yeah. Maria, are you prepared to fishbowl?
I already went twice.
Okay, thank you, Maria. For your fishbowl, it could be really you could talk about anything, but you could literally read from your journal. You could talk about what was discussed in your breakout rooms, or you could talk about anything that I mentioned in the notes right now. So that's what's on the table. Kaylin, have you done 2 fishbowls already?
No, I've done one.
Okay.
Yeah, I can do it.
Okay, so we'll have Kaylin. This will be your last one for the semester, okay?
Mhm.
Monica, I don't know if I asked you or not, but have you done 2 fishbowls already, Monica?
No, I've done one, but I'm willing to go.
Okay, thank you. Monica, so we'll get one more. Jesse, I feel like you fishbowled twice. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, man. JR, are you prepared to fishbowl?
Me?
Yeah. No, sorry, JR, not Jaden, excuse me. Jacobo.
For the fishbowl, can I ask questions or
Yeah.
about the notes or no?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, then yeah, I'll go.
All right, so we'll have Kaylin, Monica, and JR for our fishbowl today. Whoever wants to start it off, it's on you. JR, Monica,
Oh,
Kaylin.
yeah, no, I'll go first. Sorry. Okay, so I wanted to talk about the the part where like at the end where the guys' privates were cut off, because it was a bit uncomfortable for me to read it, and I was a bit like like not made like a shock like the way like that they would like teach the young kids to to show them that you shouldn't like kind of like you shouldn't get along with Africans Americans. So like I was like because he was like being torched, he was being burned alive, they cut off his privates and they were just showing it off as like a trophy. And then like when I was reading the part where like the little boy he was looking at his parents' face, and I was like comfortable because like at a young age he's when he's following his parents' path, and like growing up I could see like why he started, like he's a sheriff and he's supposed to be protecting like his people, everybody technically, but he ended up hating a certain race like during his path growing up. And then like I just think when you talked about the postcards, I thought it was because I didn't know that, like why would they kind of like think that that's like a good thing. So I was kind of like shocked about the postcards because I've never heard about that. I think that was a new thing to me. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Monica.
I wanted to mention his writing, like you already mentioned, from like being able to tell from his perspective, and he does that really well. He does descriptions really well because when he wants to focus on something, he provides more detail to it. Like when he's describing the knife,
Right.
he like puts a lot of detail into it, even though he doesn't have to. I've like that is important, like showing where he is focusing as if we're like right there and we know exactly where he's focusing and where his eyes are moving, basically.
Yeah.
So what I have questions about is like, are all these books like based on a true story, or like they're just readings because they seem like so like intense and real, like what they did before.
Yeah, no, that shit is real, bro. Like this is, I mean, now I don't like. So let me put this way. I don't. So I can't say that Jesse is a real character, but what is described really happened, right? Like this is
Yeah,
historical.
that's what I was asking.
Yeah, like this is
Uh-huh.
American history.
Yeah, that's what, like, cause like what the book was about and all that, like all this violence and stuff. And, like what Monica said, like it does like gross out people. Like, how could they do this to people? You know, like this is something like I never read about, but like it was kind of interesting. So like I was thinking, like, is there any other books like this that you know, like that are interesting like this
Yeah, I got
that
a
you
whole,
recommend?
I got a whole bookshelf full of shit like this, bro. But to kind of sit in what you're articulating, Jr. How many other people kind of felt what Jr. is describing while you were reading this text? You could like raise your hand, just shout it out. I just want to make sure. I just want to see if others felt the same way. Okay. So with that being said, right, how does it make you feel to know that the most recent recorded lynching was in 2020? That's just last year. So this idea of progress in this country, what is it really? What's progressing? Who's progressing? How are things changing? What y'all think? And I mean, not just Jr. Anyone.
It's a question for me, or
No, it's just for
oh,
everyone,
okay,
for the whole class. But you can respond.
okay.
Paris, what do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that something Baldwin wrote about in '65, which is very uncomfortable and very descriptive, is still taking place in your lifetime? Paris, how does that make you feel?
I don't really know how to explain how it makes me feel. Like, it's just mixed emotions about it. Like, it shouldn't be happening, of course, but there's nothing. I feel like there's nothing we can really do to stop it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, especially especially due to the fact that this was published in '65. Lynching's been happening way before then, and they're still happening, right? So obviously we can't do anything to stop it because I would assume that if we could, we would have done that already, right? And then,
Right.
yeah, and chances are, well, put it like this. There's a rap artist named Rhapsody who I was playing this morning, and not on this album that I was playing this morning, but another album, her most recent album. She has a song that's entitled Mara Lee, which is the wife of Medgar Evers, who was a civil rights advocate who was murdered. I want to say right before Martin Luther King. And she's rapping from the perspective of Mara Lee, from the mom of, from the wife of, I believe, Eric Garner, and one other individual who was killed by the police. And she says, I'm going to marry black, which means I'll probably have a black child, which means my black child or my husband could share the same fate as Medgar Evers or as Trayvon Martin. And what she's really rapping about is the plight that black women have to face, knowing that they're sending their sons, their husbands, their brothers, their fathers into the world that is anti-black and can snatch them from the place of this earth without any recourse, right? So yes, there's a burden that we carry as black men having to deal with not trying to be lynched, right? But then there's also the pressures and the burdens of black women who have to deal with their loved ones being snatched from them. And let's not pretend that black women weren't lynched, because they were, right? So there's a pervasiveness around these issues that we as black people have been forced to deal with for so long. And it really makes you question the fixity of this thing we call racism within this country, right? And one could argue, due to those in power's inability to deal with themselves honestly, is going to prolong this institution of racism. The whole need to stop out things like critical race theory from being taught in schools is to maintain white innocence. They don't want critical race theory to be taught because they don't want children to engage readings like y'all just read that speaks to the viciousness of this idea of whiteness. Because it's an idea, right? It's an idea that all people ascribe to. There's people who are black who ascribe and think like white supremacists, right? Because it's an idea. It's not a physical thing, right? It's an ideology. So for next week,